Good afternoon. I'm very honored to announce our final keynote speaker. Sister Teresa Forcades Vila is, to put it bluntly, a force of nature. A Benedictine nun, a feminist theologian, and a prominent activist for social justice. Sister Teresa has a non-stop schedule, speaking, teaching, and galvanizing a political movement in her native Catalonia. She's gained a huge international following through her criticisms of pharmaceutical companies and her political campaign for the region of Catalonia to gain independence from Spain. Sister Teresa is a medical doctor, has a master's degree in theology from Harvard, and a PhD in public health. Although she's been nicknamed Europe's most radical nun, Sister Teresa didn't always intend to enter religious life. She was born to an atheist family in Catalonia, and in the summer of 1995, chose to stay at the Benedictine monastery simply as a quiet place to study for her medical board exams. She was deeply moved by the community of sisters she encountered, as well as by her first reading of the Bible, which she describes as a commotion. Just 2 years later, she was taking her vows to become a Benedictine nun. Sister Teresa's rich faith life gives her the immense courage to speak truth to power, especially to the power structures in our church. She's been reprimanded by the Vatican for supporting reproductive rights, and in a recent statement on the situation for women in the Catholic Church, Sister Teresa described it as an institution in which patriarchy is rampant. All the decision-making is linked to something called ordination, and ordination is linked to something called gender. We are extremely fortunate to have such a talented, powerful woman as our keynote speaker. Please give a warm WOW 2015 welcome to Sister Teresa Forcades.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thanks. All right. Feminist ordination, a Trinitarian approach. And I would like to start with 3 questions. The first one being distinction between ordination and non-ordination, or better said, ordained versus non-ordained ministry. Does it make any sense? That's one question. Ministry, of course, it makes sense within the Christian community. It's, I would say, the core of it. Diaconia, service, ministry. We are not a religious group that wants to just enjoy in meditation, even if some of us are in a contemplative monastery or come from the monastic life. But from the beginning, in my tradition, which is the Benedictine, very clear, this incarnation of God, this finding God in space and time, it means engaging with the perfection, with the co-creation, would be the strongest theological notion. Co-creation, creation understood not as something that God has done and finished, but as something that God has prompted, has given impulse for, and now it's our duty, it's our joy, it's our possibility to take on and to move towards a direction that is not preordained and settled by God, that it is open, because that's how I think the notion, the idea, and the reality of God stays at the center of Christianity, not as a controller, not as a power from above, as a real inspiration for a path in freedom and love that has a lot of unknowns, even for God, even if the language here gets us in difficulty. So within this Christian context, is there a place, does it make sense to distinguish ordained and non-ordained ministry? That's the first question. But now I go to the second question. Second question for my presentation would be, well, does it make any sense? What does it mean to distinguish sacramental and non-sacramental? Sacramental, this word comes back to the meaning of sign, and normally in theology is described as making visible in time and space what is invisible, would be the reality of God beyond time and space. So whatever makes it visible is a sacrament of that God, of that reality. Well, if that's so, isn't life itself a sacrament? Isn't everything that we do in life a sacrament, or should it be? Does it make sense to distinguish sacramental and non-sacramental? And then, of course, how many sacraments there is and who can do them, that's, of course, hanging from here. But let's just stay at this. My specialty in theology is fundamental theology. So you can see we stay at the fundamental level, right? So ordained, non-ordained ministry, does it make sense or not? Sacramental, distinguished from non-sacramental. Is there a place for such a distinction, or we should just abolish it altogether? And then the last question would be, to pose it in a succinct way, well, is somehow the Eucharist holier than baptism, given that there is a sacrament called baptism that women can perform even if in an emergency or when there is a lack of priests, but there is another one called Eucharist, that this one under no conditions, right? Well, does it make sense, this distinction? Is there then something intrinsically other, different, and not only other and different, but higher, holier, sacred, more sacred in Eucharist as opposed to baptism? Because otherwise, how can we found this distinction or fundament this distinction? Those three questions to kind of set the context in which the reflections that I will do now, well, how I think about it. I don't know yet, at this moment of the talk, whether we want to make a distinction between sacrament and non-sacrament, or ordained and non-ordained. But I know one thing, and this is that the Christian community, as such, as a Christian community, is a sacrament of the communion of God, a sacrament of the Trinity. That's why I say my talk, feminist ordination and Trinitarian approach. I'm basing what I'm saying now on the 17th chapter of John. The Gospel of John is maybe my preferred chapter for the implications that I believe have not yet been fully explored, fully developed in the Christian communities. Chapter 17 of the Gospel of John, sometimes it's called, and this is already a misnomer, it's called the priestly prayer of Jesus. It's this prayer that Jesus addresses to the Father before the Passion, before the guards are ready to take him, before he moves to Gethsemane, and then comes the arrest and the torture and then the execution under the political and religious power. It's one of the shortest chapters in the New Testament. And in such a short chapter, chapter 17 of the Gospel of John, Jesus, for 4 times in such a short chapter, says something that can be and remains, I think, up to this day, astounding. And what it says is, Father, in the language, of course, of this use of patriarchal language in this case, but I quote directly from the Gospel, it says, Father, that they be one like we are one. Again, like you and I are one, that they be also one. A third time and a fourth time. 4 times in such a short paragraph. This, in the history, I say it has been underdeveloped because this unity between the Father and the Son, said in other words, this unity between this invisible God beyond time and space and a visible human being that claims to be fully God on earth and on time and space, this unity in the Holy Spirit is what the later development in theology has called the Trinity. And this Trinity, and what it means, it has remained as something completely separate from the daily life, something that maybe some specialized theologians want to engage with, but nothing that is relevant to our daily lives. And yet, we have at such a key moment. Is there something? What? Okay. So at such a key moment in this biography of Jesus, it comes, as I said, for 4 times this prayer, and this pointing at the possibility for us as human beings to experience, to fully experience the same communion, the same unity that God experiences in God's own self, life, whatever words we want to use in that sense. This sacramental, full sacramental character of the Christian community, that of course raises a lot of questions. There is one word in the tradition of Trinitarian theology that is a technical word that I want to now briefly quote and explain. That's the word perichoresis, that in Greek. Perichoresis, there is also the Latin circumcision, that means the same thing. But I will be now with the Greek word, perichoresis. Perichoresis, it's formed from 2 Greek words, the peri, very well-known suffix or prefix, that it means around, peri. And then comes choresis, from choreo, and this root means, can be translated for making a space. It's the same root, choreo, that you can find in the word choreography, for example. That's an English word, to dance or to, yes, a dance can be called a choreography because a dance is a graphos, is a writing in space. So you write in space with a dance. You are telling a story, but you do it not with words, you do it in space. So choreography has this root. Perichoresis, how can we translate this? Well, in a direct way, it would be peri, around, choreo, to make a space. Perichoretic love, the inner core of this mystery of the Trinity, of this reality of God, would be then to make space around the other. So that this relationship that Jesus is encouraging us in this prayer to adopt in our Christian communities, and if we do that, and in the measure that we do that, will be sacrament, or will be true to our sacramental character as a community, it gets concreted in a way of relationship that understands love not as much, having nothing against this, but not as much as we understand it erotically, which is also not a problem in the Christian understanding, but erotic love understands love as the desire to go inside the other person, or to have the other person go inside of me. And that can be very powerful and very deep. And of course, I don't want to imply this is less sacred or this should be pushed aside. But the problem with this erotic understanding of love is that I might want to do that violently. I might do it out of the best free relationship with the other person, and then it would be perichoretic. But the essence of perichoresis, we need to link to this aspect of freedom, because I might really fully and deeply desire to go inside of the other person, or that the other person comes inside, or we get fused in some way, but I can desire that even against the free will of the other person. And so that is what makes that erotic metaphor, in that way that I'm explaining, with this possibility, less able to be sacrament in that aspect. Perichoretic love means that, how do I know whether my relationship with the other person deserves that name of love or not? Well, it would be that simple, is my relationship to the other person is making space, is centered in making a space that the other, so that the other person can be whatever she or he or it or whatever wants to be. Regardless whether this desire of the other person brings that person closer to me, which might be very well what I desire, or not. Am I making sense with this, perichoresis? Perichoretic love means that God is treating us like that. It means that whatever the desire in the Old Testament is being expressed time and again of having this communion with us, and God keeps expressing that in the text of the Old and the New Testament repeatedly. No matter how strong that desire on God's part is, it's never in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we have some passages that need to be interpreted, of course, but the tenet of this conversation and of this revelation, of this address of God to the human beings, it always has a limit. And the limit is the human free will that says yes, or says no, or says come back later, or says I'll think about it. And Jesus repeatedly is like the drama of his trying to convey to whoever wanted to hear him how the desire of God is so strong and so ready for this communion in the mutual respect, for this communion that's not hierarchical, for this communion that is not patronizing, and how we say, okay, I'll think about it a bit later, I'll come, and maybe tomorrow, right? So this depth of the proposal that God consistently in history is making to us, this depth of the perichoretic relationship, I understand it is the depth of what it means to be a Christian community, to realize that in time and space. And let me now say a couple of words about what it means to speak about being a sacrament of this reality of God, if there are three things, I think there are not two, but three things that are essential to us as human beings that God does not have, which are, as human beings, we cannot understand ourselves if it is not in space and time. Those are the classical philosophical categories from Kant and before and after. Time and space as what defines the human experience. I'm speaking now about the human experience as sacrament of God, and God, at least the classical theology, claims is beyond time and space, is not in time and space. But I said three categories because I think the human experience is defined truly by space, by time, but also by sexuality. Space, time, sex. Without that, we don't understand what is a human. I cannot understand what is a human. And yet, the human being is supposed to be at the image of God. I'm speaking of the human being as the sacrament of God, and at the same time, I am part of a tradition, and I will also today keep claiming that God, beyond the incarnation, is truly not in space, not in time, not in sexuality. Reproductive sexuality, polarity sexuality, whatever the real word means in the real world. The real word means in the real world. So how can we understand that? Does it make any sense to have then these categories and this gap? Is it not a contradiction then? Well, I would claim that there is a way to live these three categories, a way to experience time, a way to experience space, and a way to experience sexuality that help us, or that is open. It is not a hindrance, but it is actually the condition of possibility for us to experience what is it that God is trying to tell us, what is it that God is being. Is that being a bit too philosophical or heavy, or is it okay? So I'll do this part a bit quicker, but I think it's very important for me to then base what I think it is, well, ordination, and to answer the question that I started at the beginning. So, space. Well, in God there is no space. It is true. But in God, in the Christian God, in the Trinitarian God, there is something of which we would have no clue unless we would be living in space. And the something that there is in God and we would have no clue about without the space, it is reciprocity. This is not like a given thing. Of course, there are many notions of God that have nothing to do with reciprocity. There are many notions of God, and sadly, in the Christian tradition, many times we have had notions of God that have nothing to do with reciprocity, even though we come from this tradition, which say God basically is a giver. God is somebody that is able to, it has everything in it, and it just gives it, and then it's so generous and so loving that is able to kind of open up, but opens up from a position of power or from a position of fullness, a position that does not entail or understand the term reciprocity. This notion of Trinity means that within God, in God, whatever God is, it is not thinkable without reciprocity, without giving, but also receiving. That, I think, it's one of these fundamental notions that we have not explored enough. And this, of course, in the Trinity means the relationship between the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. But it means also, because there is no separation, there can be no separation between what God is and what God is for us and with us. So it means that with us, God also presents herself not as only the giving pole, but also as a receiving. And it means also that if the church, if the Christian community wants to be a sacrament of God in the world, the Christian community, the church, cannot present itself in the world as having only something to give the world. I do believe the church, the Catholic Church, the different churches, the fidelity to the gospel implies being in the world with something to offer. I do believe that, I defend that, and I think we cannot just pretend that this is not the case. It's our responsibility. We have something to announce, we have something to give witness to, and we have something to say that many people have no clue about if other people don't tell them, right? I would have. They have presented me as saying, Teresa comes from an atheist family. Well, it is true that I had the baptism and also I had the first communion. So you might say, okay, a very strange atheist family. But that's because when I was little, I was still under the fascist government of Franco in Spain. That was national Catholicism. So that meant socially it was problematic not to baptize the children, not to have them do the first communion. So my parents are not like martyrs of the atheism, and so they just went through whatever socially accepted moves they were, but they warned me as a child, the Catholic Church is an outdated institution. It's like the monarchy. That's what they told me, right? So they said, they are still there, but they don't make any sense in the modern world. So they will just go away slowly and you don't need to bother with them. So that's basically what I had heard. And so with that, I mean to say that it's not that they were belligerent. They were not anti-church. They didn't give me a sense of negativity, but they just said irrelevant, right? Something that in the past, and that's it. That was but then when I was 15 years old, they said, got the opportunity to read the Gospels for the first time. And for me, that was a transformative experience. But I got the chance to read them because somebody offered me to read them. And this somebody had offered. So definitely this giving pole of God and the church and us as a Christian community, I think we have to be aware of, affirm, and take responsibility for. But here comes what I was saying now. That's not enough. That's not enough. Only setting ourselves in the world as givers does not allow the world, not allow us to be representatives, or in that sense, sacrament of the Christian God. Because it's a God that has also a receiving end. And how God can have a receiving, well, that's what puzzled the theologians and the theological reflection of Christianity from the beginning. It's like one author after the other. As you know, it took 500 years to come to this notion of the Trinity, problematic and it might be, that says the receiving end and the giving end, the Father and the Son, are equally divine, equally full in divinity. It's not one more than the other. And it took 1,500 years more, and I would say still, to make sense of what that means and to bring what that means into real concrete structures in our communities. So what it means to present ourselves as a church in the world saying, yes, I have something to give, I'm ready to give it. Of course, German comes and crosses me, but of course, never as an imposition, because that would be a contradiction, but I have something to give, but I have also something to receive. In my receiving, I am being as fully a testimony, as fully a sacrament of God, as in my giving. How can we make that concrete in our communities? What kind of world and what kind of dynamic in the community, what kind of ministers, what kind of ordained ministers, what kind of relationship with these ministers should we set up so that these are not only words and become a reality among us? Space has, of course, of these three categories, I will say there is a way of experiencing them that help us make sense of it in the direction of what this creation is supposed to be in its fulfillment, and this would be for space, reciprocity, but in each of these categories there is a way that actually hinders that. And for the first one, for space, of course the other two, it's a bit schematic what I'm going to do now, but I'll do it a bit for the sake of doing it a bit quicker. But you can leave a space, of course, not as experience of reciprocity, but you can leave space in a way ignoring space. Ignoring space means ignoring the otherness of the other. It means pretending that there is differences that are only at the superficial level. The differences are something like an appearance of differences, but that if you are able, and these many philosophies have thought like that if you are able to have a deeper sight, to have a deeper way of looking into things, what you find is the unity. Well, that's not what the Trinity means. The Trinity says the unity and the diversity are equally optimal, are equally divine, are equally last reality. It's not true that you have a diversity and then deeper down there is a unity. No, there is a unity together with a diversity, and there is a diversity together with a unity. And to make it concrete, not to leave it so abstract, the example would be what my mother abbess said when I entered the monastery. I had come from the United States. I did my medical training and then theological training in the United States. And then I entered the monastery in '97. The abbess told me, well, Teresa, what do you think will be the goal of this time that you'll be a postulant? That's the year that we started the monastery. We are called postulants. We are not yet novices. And I said, well, I come from very different atmosphere and context, so I will try to adapt myself as much as I can to the ways of the monastery. And then she was disappointed. I said, okay, what's the problem? I thought that was a very obvious answer, right? What should I be saying now? What's the right answer? So she said, no, of course I understand what you mean, and I appreciate that you have this willingness to fit in and all these things, but you know what? And then she told me her dream of what a Christian community should say. And she said, well, I believe that God has made each of us a unique piece, and each of us original in a very profound way. So I understand, as an abbess of this community, that my role would be to, if the community works well, it's not that we start being very different, and then after a few years of living together, we start coming to a common ground, so to speak. But on the contrary, that if we are a true living Christian community, we start very differently. This is obvious. And after 10 years of working together, we are even more different than we were when we started. That's what she said. I said, okay, I'm going to meditate about it. Because that's how she understood this, what I was saying in abstract, right? This space as being something that's not an opportunity to just get to unity. Of course, unity is essential for what I'm talking about and for the Christian experience, but it's a rather peculiar type of unity. It's a unity that it needs diversity. It's not a unity that tolerates diversity. It's not a unity that says, it's impossible to have everybody thinking the same way, so let's tolerate diversity. It's like a unity that says, wait a minute, we have a problem in this community because we all think alike. Let's get somebody else so that we don't stagnate, right? So in that sense, this valuing, deep, fundamental, theological, metaphysical, whatever, practical valuing of diversity and not setting it against unity, that's a huge challenge. And here there are a huge ways of ministering that we can envision, not only to speak about it, but to enact that in reality. What does it mean for us as a community in that sense? The second one I spoke is about time. And this time, and this scheme that I was doing is, of course, with the space, you can either make it, ignore it, and that would be this colonialism, imperialism, this denying the otherness of the other as such, or you can make it absolute. And this, if the sin of modernity is ignoring the otherness, the sin, we could say, of postmodernity, that's a scheme, right? It's making it absolute. And then you say the otherness of the other is so real that there is no reaching out. The isolation of the self, right? The fragmentation of the world. That's a huge topic in contemporary philosophy about this constatation or this understanding that the differences are so fundamental that there is only an illusion of communion, an illusion of reaching out to others. But in reality, you remain isolated from others. This is a philosophical position that would be making absolute a real aspect of our lives, which is a space. So the point would be neither ignore it, like modernity, colonialism, imperialism, or also not making it absolute, as maybe contemporary fragmentation, isolation of the self, understanding. With time, a similar setup could be expressed to see what the horizon of meaning, as I understand it, is, because God doesn't have time. We said God doesn't have space, but it has reciprocity. God does not have time, but it has what? What is the corresponding category that in God exists? And which one? What? Again? Eternity. Well, you could say eternity, but in a way eternity is denying time, right? Although you can say it's a time that is of a different quality. No, what I was thinking of is truth. In God there is truth. God is true. God says, I'm true. I'm not a false God. I'm not an idol, right? Others are false. Why? Because they say, I'll be there, and they don't come. That's the notion of truth. We have a notion of truth that is propositional truth. 1 and 1, 2, that's true. Okay, but that's not really truth. Truth, 1 and 1 is 2 in a decimal system. But if it's a binary system, 1 and 1 is 1 or 0, I don't know, whatever it is. I don't know. But binary systems only have 0 and 1, right? So 1 and 1 in binary system is not 2, that's for sure. That I know for sure. The other one, I always get it wrong, so I don't know if it's 0 or 1. So yes, we can say it's true, 1 and 1, it's 2, but it's a different kind of truth. And God has nothing to do with this truth. And it's not, okay, it's okay, but that has nothing to do with these fundamental things. No, God is true in the sense that God is faithful. Fidelity is an English word, right? Fidelity is something that our being in time gives us an opportunity to experience fidelity. And the two kind of misguided ways of dealing with time that usually we are experiencing all the time are, of course, fundamentalism or dogmatism, which is denying the time. Like the imperialism or colonialism denies the space, the otherness, there is also a way of denying the time. So you say, I'm a true person, a notion of truth that it is, I said this 10 years ago, and you find me 10 years later, I say exactly the same thing. That's a consistent person. It's like, really? Maybe, but if time you take seriously, you need something that Vatican II, the Council, named creative fidelity. Fidelity, yes, but not immobility. You cannot say, I met you once here, so 10 years later I'm still waiting for you here because you've moved. So if I'm really faithful to you, I have to move. Otherwise, I'm going to miss you and I will think it's your fault, right? But it's the real thing. It's if I want to be with you, love, it has to be true and faithful. But that doesn't mean immobile. Because life, if you acknowledge time, you can just pretend you are a spirit that floats in no time, and then nothing what I'm saying applies to you. But if you really are incarnated and you are in time, you have to move to be faithful. You have to move to be true. You have to move to be really in the truth. And this is what God does all the time, isn't it? In the Gospels or in the whole Old Testament. It's like making a proposal and we say, the people, or no, thank you. And then God just moves and comes and says, okay, here I am now. Now, how do we try like this? And we say, yeah, later. And then it comes here again, right? So each one of us can know in the own biography, right, how that has happened and how always love is like this. It's always creative, it's always moving, it's always dynamic, it's never stagnated, right? So this would be the first temptation scene, whatever you want to call it, also has to do with modernity in this little scheme, which is fundamentalism, which is dogmatism. But the other one also, postmodernity, relativism. Oh, there is no truth. I don't believe that. I said to you already, there is something we have to give, right? Our world, and if our world tends to say there is no truth, everything is relative, I say no, abuse is not relative. Abuse is wrong, no matter when and where, and no matter how you feel personally about it. Abuse is wrong. Violence sometimes can be good, like Jesus in the temple, right? This kind. But violence that is from the stronger to the weaker, this is also, you can call it abuse. This is always, discrimination is always wrong. No matter what, sexism, it's always wrong. And racism is always wrong. This is true, I think it is true. And this kind of truth needs to be said again and again in the world in words that acknowledge the reality that keeps changing. But it is something true, truly remaining there. It's not relativism. It's not just going with the flow and keep changing. So that would be the second. And then the third that I said, usually we say time and space, and on why do I bring sex to this? There is no mystery. I do it because I think it's true. That's like the human experience. Of course, that the sexuality, it is experienced in the time and in the space, but it brings something that if I only do these reflections with time and space, something is missing, because in God, there is not only reciprocity, there is not only truth or fidelity, there is something else. And this something else, I believe we would have no clue about if we didn't have sexuality in our lives. And this something else, I think it is fire. That's the name I give to it. But you could have a sense of reciprocity, kind of contained, right? You can have a sense of truth, also kind of, I don't know, contained or serene, but there is something else in God. There is fire, there is desire, there is craziness. There is in all the, isn't it? All the saints are a bit crazy. Like you look at Francis, and it's like, I need something else. Francis of Assisi is not the Pope. I mean, also, but or you look to certain saints, right? Or Gertrude and Teresa of Avila and so many, right? All of them, if they are truly, so they are a bit crazy. They have a kind of unease, right? There is a bursting of life or a bubbling of life. There is something that, okay, you can use another word. You can say also the Holy Spirit with the wind that just moves everything and you don't know where it blows. There is a breaking of limits. There is a breaking that cannot be contained in a concept. And this, you can call it life also, right? So God is alive. But fire, I think it's good. And I relate that with sexuality because I believe that in our human experience, that is what can come into the life and just unsettle it in ways that were not pre-ordered or pre-planned. And in this sexuality, I believe that there is a sense of, which is what I relate to fire, which is a sense of wanting to come out of the self in a way. The words cannot come and express that very well, but it is a sense of, I want to be myself, and I want to be fully myself, but as if in a love experience, I could have the intuition, in order to be fully myself, I have to somehow move beyond, open up, and just let go in a very fundamental way. And this is what I bring together as something that also brings us to God, and it brings us to this very deep inner aspect of God as a life, fire, full reality. And of course, the two ways that this love could be, or this sexuality, or this sex could be experienced in a reductionist way that does not open up to their divine potential, they coincide with the stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. And they also could be aligned to this historical moment we call modernity and postmodernity. The modernity would be the stereotypical masculine, right? Which is the self understood as for itself, or for himself, or herself, like this, what Augustine calls in se, right? I am in myself, and that's what I am. And the stereotypical feminine, which would be more part of the postmodernity scenario, would be understanding the self as for others, as this relationality, essential relationality that nowadays is so popular, or so in different philosophical approaches is kind of being developed and being studied and being pondered, how the understanding of who we are fundamentally has to do with links and connections, and not only the internet one, but on this connectivity that it's so proper to us nowadays, and how this sense of consistent being in itself that characterizes modernity, today we rather, in literature also, in different approaches, we rather look at it with certain, how is that? Skepticism, right? What do you mean in yourself? You are empty in yourself. It's only what you are in relationship to others that has to do. So this stereotypical femininity, masculinity, of course, how the Christian community can make that dimension that is open-ended of the sexual reality alive is precisely the contrary to what we have been doing until now, at least in the Catholic Church. I speak for the Catholic Church now, with what is called the Anthropology of Complementarity. And I think you have had the talk I've seen in the, right? Somebody addressed that, right? The complementarity is something that might sound appealing, right? Because what we know as feminists, we absolutely will be against is hierarchy between feminine and masculine, but complementarity, why not? Maybe some of those who are here think favorably to complementarity. That would be a whole other talk, but this, what I'm setting as the item or the characteristic of the sexuality, is not compatible, as I am putting it up, with complementarity, because it needs to open up space for a unique, original experience for each human being. And it cannot be categorized. That's why I use sometimes the expression queer theology. And I do myself queer theology. This is only a word, but queer, it's queer theory. Nowadays, it has been the space of reflection where people have tried to move radically beyond all categories, to think the human experience as an opportunity to bring up a radically new space for each human person. That's a challenge. It's a challenge because the fear of freedom is part of what we experience personally, but it's socially a challenge because we are not ready in the church or in the society to make space for people to be what they really want to be without asking them whether they belong to this one or to that other one. Actually, well, that's an anecdote. Yesterday I went to London and I slept there in order to catch the plane for today to be here. And this morning, when it was very early and I entered the breakfast place, and then the woman who was there said, "Oh, good morning, sir." What? And then she looked, said, sorry, because it's still, right? Nowadays, this is not something that is not very important to categorize people in one or the other group, even if we've moved a lot in that sense, and I think it's important to open that up. Okay, all this was just to give a sense of how do I understand this sacramentality of the, how are we with time? Okay, so the sacramentality, but the truth is that one of the main characteristics of this being of God, of this Trinitarian reality of which we are called by Jesus to be sacrament of, is the lack of hierarchy. It is, again, I said already, astounding and very difficult has been for the theology to speak about it without making a hierarchy, without saying the Father somehow is more important, then comes the Son, then comes the Holy Spirit. And we have nowadays in the Catholic Church an ordained ministry called the Sacrament of the Holy Orders that acknowledges a bishop, that in some text and in some theological approaches somehow is related to this Father, then priest related to Jesus, and then deacon related to Holy Spirit, and understands this ordained ministry as a hierarchy, as the bishop having the fullness of the Sacrament of Orders, and then the priest, and then the deacon, and, as you know, as having, even though the Vatican II tried to break that, as having like a, not only a ranking, but like a career, right? That you moved from deacon to priest, and if you are lucky and if you are successful enough, then you reach to be a bishop. This is, of course, completely contrary, and it doesn't allow us to be, so to have nowadays in the Catholic Church an understanding of ordained ministry as something that includes and reinforces and actually fully upholds the hierarchical understanding. I think it's a structural sin, a structural hindrance, a structural problem that I said sexism is rampant in the Catholic Church is true, clericalism is also, and this is part of, I think, what we need to change, and to change as soon as possible, rather quickly, if we can. That is But not because we are 21st century people and we don't like hierarchies because it's not anymore in order. That's why I did this rather lengthy introduction, but because my goal today is to give such a theological fundament as deep as I can to why it's so very deeply wrong to speak about this, even if it were comfortable. And you could say, well, why? You need to just have everybody like with the same power, and why that? You just let some just have more responsibility and the others obey. What's the problem? Is that selfish or a self-centered desire or a need to adapt the church to the 21st century? And no, to me, that has nothing to do with this. It's an attempt to be minimally, to start to be faithful to what is our mission in the world as church, as Christian community, which is, as I said, not only to give, it's also to receive, but what we have to give has to do with a non-hierarchical, deeply, fundamentally non-hierarchical understanding of difference. And you say, well, what a strange God. Okay, but it's our God, or it's the Christian God. It's a God that has difference, and it's a non-hierarchical difference. And how do you express that? With difficulty, but that's also part of being a sacrament, is that you cannot just bring God into categories. You cannot just neatly pack God and say, okay, I'm delivering it to you. You just have to become a bit uncomfortable when we talk about it, because it's not an object of our understanding, it's a subject. And a subject is always something that does break all categories. So this hierarchical understanding is, of course, fundamentally wrong, but it is also fundamentally wrong. Now I pick up the questions that I said before. Do we need ordained and non-ordained ministry? Okay, well, it depends. To my understanding is, if ordination, that's why I gave the title Feminist Ordination. Ordination has to do with order, right? Well, I'm part of a Benedictine community. We were 40 nuns for many years. Now we are down to 30 because some have died, and although others have entered, so now we are down 10 nuns. But still, 30 is quite a bit. And you are here, I don't know how many people, but I spoke to the organizing team, and organizing, it's to be taken seriously, right? If we take seriously time and space, organizing is not like, no, yeah, of course, we have a non-hierarchical God, we'll have Christian communities, just people come in and they do whatever they feel, and that's the best. Well, no, I don't think so. At least that's not how I have experience in my community, that to try to be truth to what I'm talking about implies. So there is a practical aspect that needs to be acknowledged, and that's not a problem. And you cannot read, everybody cannot read every day, and so you have a minister of reading, and everybody cannot lead the community, and I acknowledge a leading ministry, and this is important to have it acknowledged. So I have, at a practical level, I think it's obvious to me that you need to have some kind of appointed ministry, appointed to make the distinction. Now, does it mean that all ministry that is sacramental, that then I'll go into the sacramental, it's only when it is appointed and there is the laying of hands or whatever in the ceremony we want to do? Well, why should we think like this? Why should we think like this if we believe that we have, as a Christian community, as baptized and even as human beings in our own, have this capacity to be transparent to what God is, to make visible in the time and space what God is, which has to do with reciprocity, which has to do with truthfulness or with fidelity, and has to do with fire. This reality of God, when it is visible in the world, this is a sacrament, I believe, of what God is. And this sacrament can be within a community expressed and made visible through appointed ministries, the ordained ministries, but also through ministries, services, realities that have not gone through this appointed path. Do I make myself clear in that? And one small example of that, very small, but it's, for example, in my community, on Vespers, we pray the Vespers every day, and there is a moment of prayer. So this moment, a sister is in charge of the prayer, so she goes and she does the prayers, and the others answer. On Sunday and festivities, the sister in charge does the same thing, but instead of closing, she just goes to her place, she sits, and then everybody who wants can do the prayer, which is, we could do the prayers like this every day. I'm not saying this is better than another thing, but I'm just giving a very simple example of what can be a coexistence of ordained or appointed, in that sense, and non-appointed ministry. And I don't consider that makes any theological sense, that when the sister who is appointed and in charge by the community to say the prayer, says the prayer, there is something there, sacred. And when the other sister says the prayer, then no. What's the point? I mean, I don't think there is, but, as I said before, the conclusion for me is not, so then don't appoint anything. No, because it's a practical thing, and it's beautiful, and it's good, and it's appropriate, I think. And when I'm making this point about the practicality of appointing or ordaining, because I'm using the term exchangeable, I think you had also Gary Macy here, right, that talked about, that's one of the authors that has also helped us see, right, how in the history of Christianity, this term ordination has, of course, not always meant the same. And I know that because my community comes from the 13th century, and we have files in our archive that go back there, and the abbesses were ordained. Oh, they were priests. Nope, they were not priests. They were ordained because this word, well, I don't know, maybe they were. In our case, they had the mitra and the bacul, the staff, right? But I like to think in this way, that not necessarily that means that they were exactly what today ordination means, because ordination means for sure appointment, right? You just say, the community says, and it is, a ceremony belongs to that, and it might be the laying of hands, which is a beautiful sign of commissioning, right? Because all this comes also, again, with this sacramental understanding, and I'm developing today a Trinitarian approach to ordination. Sacramental understanding is in the Trinity, there is a sending also. There is a commissioning, right? There is a kind of a distinction between or within this reality of God, this sending of the Son on the incarnation, which also, incidentally and very relevant, I think, to the issue of ordination, St. Augustine, in his thick volume about the Trinity, insists, and then Thomas Aquinas and all these Catholic renowned acknowledged theologians of classical theology, they all insist that when the Son is sent to the incarnation, the Father and the Holy Spirit send it, and the Son sends himself also. But I think this is important because, as I understand in the Christian community, there has to be always this tension, creative tension, between this affirmation of the self in relationship, substantial, fundamental, deep relationship with others, but not a dichotomy. It's not, if I'm being sent by the community, I am a null, I am like nothing, like being there, and then they send me. Like if I were an object that it's being sent. No, that's not, I don't think this, and I'm making this thing because yesterday we had the blessing of our new abbess, and that's why I couldn't come before, because we elected a few months ago, and it was a beautiful ceremony, but I won't go long now. It was done at the monks' church because too many people wanted to come, and there was a moment where really the abbess was seated in a way that it looked like this, right? She was like doing nothing, and she was being done, right? So I think in that sense, there is also something we need to change in some of these rituals, so that this action, that the one being sent is also active in the sending, and it is in a fundamental way that belongs to this sacramentality of the Trinity. So ordained, my answer would be yes, I think there is no problem in having ordained ministries, but I said already, these ordained ministries do not set apart, do not bring a holier, more sacred, more, and especially the most sensitive issue would be an ordained ministry cannot bring that person an inch or a iota or whatever it would be closer to God. That sense of the old priestly understanding as mediator between the realm of invisible God and the visible things. You need a mediator, okay, so Jesus Christ, which is God and which is fully human, and then you have the mess again and don't know how to solve this, is the only one, right? The letter of Hebrews is very clear. So I don't think a feminist ordination or a Trinitarian ordination can accept at all any sense of mediation between God and the human, and any ordained ministry in between. That makes absolutely no sense. But as I was saying before, it's not a matter only of practicality. It's not a matter only of saying, well, we need practical things, so we appoint people. No, because in acknowledging this diversity, also in charismas, this diversity in the gift that everyone has, this diversity in the need of differentiating, that has a sacramental value. So when I say, the second question I had posed for today, whether there is a need or makes sense to distinguish sacramental and non-sacramental, I think it does make sense, but it makes sense because, as I said before, some reality, some way that we can live our human reality, personally and in community, because this always, even if we acknowledge or not, always we have both dimensions active in ourselves, because we are done to the image of God, and God is communion, is Trinitarian, so always I have a self, and I have an interconnection with others. Even if I don't acknowledge, even if I don't want it, even if I refuse this is how I understand is our existential reality as human beings. So in that sense, that the sacramentality, then why do I want to use the word? Why don't I stay saying human experience in itself is sacramental, and that's about it? Because, as I said before, with time and space and sexuality, there are ways of living my time and my space and my sexuality that are actually a hindrance to understanding what is the divine presence in this dimension. And the hindrance would be when I, as I said before, commit abuse, and abuse I already mentioned. That's a human experience, but that's not a sacramental reality. This is an anti-sacramental reality. And I think that needs to be said, and needs to be said with full force. So there are aspects of life, ways of living life, ways of being community, and ways of being alone also that are not sacramental. That always, as a human being, we have the potential, having been ordained or not, appointed or not, acknowledged or not by a community, that's not what gives us or takes from us this capacity to be a sacrament of God. But the reality that we experience our human life in such a way that can be opening up the path or the way for this full divine reality, a full divine reality that at the beginning of Christianity was called with its full name, that today we use very little, and we think sometimes it's maybe even heretical, which is the divinization, right? Divinization, right? In Greek, theosis, that's saying that the human is called to be divine. It sounds a bit even heretical nowadays still, right? Depending which context. But of course that is not only a necessary understanding of who we are as human beings, but a very classical one. That's actually the one that was predominant in the first centuries of patristic theology. Theosis, divinization, is the only purpose of human life, according to patristic theology. And we could say matristic also, because we start to know every day more how women were active, and I especially study Macrina, that it seems the rule of Basil from Caesarea, we should call it the rule of Macrina, right? Because she was 20 years active in a monastery, he spent 2 years in the monastery, and the rule he wrote, I don't believe this. Because in a monastic community, when you enter, they tell you, okay, after 2 years, okay, wait until 20, and then you open up the mouth, which is not very nice that they tell you. But it means you need to be there, you need to live, and you need to know what the daily life is to be able to make a rule like the one that it's called the rule of Basil. Macrina was 20 years, an abbess, and he just spent less than 2 years in the monastery. So a lot of research, contemporary research, are mentioning this. So all this patristic theology, at its core, the notion of theosis, the notion of divinization. And this notion is the one that makes sense when we think about ordination. How do we foster this, and how do we, this sacramentality, bring it in this way? So yes, I do think that there is a space to distinguish between sacrament and non-sacrament. But it's not, well, here, just to mention, in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus dies, the rendering of the curtain of the temple, right? From top to bottom, the curtain that separated sacred from non-sacred. But this separation was a separation that had to do with hierarchy. Again, space that was only for a few people, separated from the space of the priests. The high priest actually only could go there, and once a year, the other space. No, this separation has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I think feminist ordination gets rid of this separation, but keeps and should keep a distinction between what is sacramental and what is not. Sacramental has to do with this perichoretic presence, with this active love in freedom, and there are other options in the world, and we should keep the strength and keep the theological path open to criticize frontally in a prophetic way all this, and not get into a kind of a conception that doesn't allow us to make these differences. And then, of course, the last question that I said, which is whether this baptism or Eucharist is holier than the baptism. Well, just a few words about this. We have in the Catholic Church 7 sacraments for men and 6 for women. This is how it's said today. And I don't think this number, 7 sacraments, is something that we need to defend in the 21st century as if it were God-given. Why, for example, a man that gets ordained as a priest, that is a sacrament. A man or a woman that gets married, that is a sacrament. And a woman that it's a nun, that's not a sacrament. Why not? No, it's there. I thought about it, right, as you can imagine, and I don't find any theological reason. It's like it's an engagement for your whole life. It's something that you do publicly. It's something you do in the church. Why? Why shouldn't that be a sacrament? Well, because we wanted 7, and 7 is a number but that makes no sense. And why? The washing of the feet, it's at least in Catholic theology, a sacramental, but not a sacrament. What is this? I mean, I've tried to make sense of this, but because as you see, right, I'm trying to be nuanced or whatever, but it makes no sense to me. So I think it's fundamental that we acknowledge in feminist theology and with an idea of feminist ordination, that this notion of sacrament, we have to take responsibility for that. What do we call sacraments? What do we not? In no case, of course, with the ordination of women and with all these issues, can we hide ourselves under, oh, we've always done it like this, because when we study it, we realize it's not the case. But even if it had been the case, even if we had done something in the same way always, we still need to take responsibility. And this is not something that the church is not doing. I'll give a very brief example, which is one of the night of Easter, there are all the readings of the longest prayer and vigil and whole year biggest moment of prayer in the liturgical year. And one night, one year, as I was preparing for the readings of that night, I realized that the Catholic Church, suggests to us that one of the readings is the reading from Ezekiel 36, from 16 to 36. That's one of the readings for that night of Easter. But in the the book of the Liturgy of the Hours, and in all the lectionaries, it is actually the proposal, what's proposed to be read that night is not Ezekiel 36, 16, 36, but it says, and you can look after when we are done, it says Ezekiel 36, 16, 17a, 36. You can look, it's like that. So of course I had the question, what does it say in 17b? Right? It's like, why it's been left out from this reading? Because it's like not only 17b. You were defiling the land, and you were unclean like a woman who menstruates. That's what it says. And the church, misogynist as it is and sexist as it is, but it is nevertheless 21st century, and thought that's too much. To say that, too much. To say that on the holier night, on that day where everybody should be like getting really the point of what God is all about, to just proclaim from the altar and say, and this is that reading that God is telling to the people, I'm doing all this for you, I'm giving you all my best, and you are defiling everywhere you go as a people, you defile me and you do against what I'm asking you to do, which is to just live this life of justice, and you are just abusing the poor, and you are doing everything that I despise and don't like. And then, 17b, you are like a woman who is menstruating, and it's defiling and making uncleanness, right? And this is put in the words of God. So I'm just giving you this example because why? And that has been my question to my community many times, but we keep doing it the same because in our church, we still read, let the women be silent in the church, right? And they say, oh, but it's in the Bible. And so I tell them, Ezekiel 36:17b, you want to read that at night? I'm going to read it the next Easter, because if we just read everything that is in the Bible, we should read this, right? But they don't want to do that, right? They say, no, better not in the night of Easter. So if we are entitled as a Christian community, as a church, to just leave out this versicle, why don't we leave out other versicles that we are doing it now? And there is no reason for that. And this is not only a matter of verses or versicles, it's like our full responsibility for how we are dealing with the sacramental reality. I've tried to do, and I'm coming to a close now, I've tried to do this foundation of fundamental theology, what that can be all about, as I understand. And so that leaves many options, many possibilities, but it demands a necessary reform of how we are understanding the sacramental life of the church right now, these ordained ministries, this hierarchical way of understanding it, and this, I think, will lead us to an upheaval or of an understanding, an unsettlement of many of our structures, but one that should, according to my understanding, not be done without guidance or without a reason to do that other than saying, today you cannot just keep up like this, the times need something else. But it is to be done with a very clear notion and sense and understanding of what it is that we are called to be as a Christian community, what is our responsibility to make visible in the world today this fundamental perichoretical understanding of what the life of God is. Thank you very much.
Teresa Forcades, thank you. It is such an honor to have you speak for us, and thank you for the work that you do for everyone. Everybody has a stole, and I would like you to have a stole. So here it is.
Thank you.